Hello, this is Ryan Hennessy from Ryan Hennessy Wastewater Microbiology. Just want to welcome you to the nitrogen removal PowerPoint presentation for our YouTube channel. And with that said, I'm going to disappear from the video so you don't have to look at me the whole time. Hope you enjoy this presentation. The goal here is going to be to talk about things from a wastewater operations standpoint and get practical information that we could use for treatment processes. So with that said, what is nitrogen? Nitrogen is a colorless, odorless, and tasteless gas that's predominant in Earth's atmosphere and present in all organic matter. So in the air, it's a gas, but it can also be many different forms. The important forms of nitrogen in wastewater are organic nitrogen, which is a mix of nitrogen containing organic compounds such as amino acids, nucleic acids, and humic substances, and inorganic nitrogen, which is nitrite, nitrite, ammonia, and ammonium. So when we test nitrogen, we have a series of different tests, and we'll get into permit requirements and what most plants have and that type of thing. So the different types of testing is TKN. So TKN is a representation of the total organic nitrogen plus the ammonia. So generally in an influent, if you're looking to get an idea of how much nitrogen is going to eventually be available for the bacteria, TKN is a very common test, and it's relatively complex and laborious. So it's usually done by commercial lab and not in-house lab. Then you have ammonia and ammonium, nitrate, nitrite, and total nitrogen. So there's other testing that includes all of the recognized forms of nitrogen as well. So why is nitrogen important? So if you look at the picture here on the right, this is basically a swamp. And the reason that those conditions called eutrophication may happen is if there's excess nutrients in a receiving water body, it's going to develop aquatic growth, algae blooms, things along those nature that will eventually deplete the oxygen, which has a downstream effect of being detrimental to the aquatic life. And eventually it ends up being a problem for the drinking water as well as just the overall food chain. So it's really important that nutrients, especially nitrogen and phosphorus, are low in receiving water bodies to maintain that water quality. Another thing is that nitrate is very detrimental to children. About 10 parts per million nitrate can cause the blue baby syndrome. Also, there's some ammonia toxicity to fish, which we'll get into. So depending on the plants and the area of the location where you're located in and what the receiving water body may be like in terms of what type of fish, recreational usage, that's usually going to dictate what you're looking at for your permit. So this is just a sample wastewater treatment plant schematic. So basically we have water that's coming in through the influent into a primary clarifier into the aeration basin where we're getting our BOD removal and our nitrification if that's what we're desiring and operating towards. And then eventually we want to develop a good biomass that's going to settle out well in the final clarifier, produce a nice clear interface between liquids and solids, and produce a nice clear final effluent. And we also have some side streams from wasting and that are also noted on the diagram. And their importance here is a lot of those side streams are very high in ammonia. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit of extra detail eventually. So biological wastewater treatment, the general goal is that when we have aerobic respiration, we have, we're taking nutrients and the food, the BOD, to carbon dioxide, water, and energy, and it involves an electron transport system using molecular oxygen as the final electron receptor. So for an aerobic reaction, you need free dissolved oxygen to exist. And when we talk about nitrification, the nitrifiers are strict aerobes, so they need free dissolved oxygen in order to work. So if we look at BOD removal, we are going to get some assimilation of nitrogen just through taking up BOD and growing new bacteria in the wastewater treatment process. So bacteria are generally about 12% nitrogen by weight. And so generally for about 100 parts BOD that's treated, you're going to take up about 5 parts nitrogen that are the bacteria are either using ammonia or nitrate, which also can be used as a nutrient. And it becomes part of the new bug mass, and we remove some of the nitrogen just through wasting of the solids. Basic types of bacteria in wastewater include heterotrophs. So heterotrophs eat carbonaceous organic material, which would be like our BOD. And then there's autotrophs, which use inorganic carbon sources. And they're fundamentally different in that they're fixing other material for their food. So for example, nitrifying bacteria are going to use alkalinity as their food source. So it's important to distinguish that the heterotrophs are eating the food, whereas the autotrophs are fixing other things for their metabolism. If we look at most municipal, kind of your standard domestic wastewater treatment plant, there tends to be about 40 milligrams per liter of TKN, which ends up generally being about 25 milligrams per liter ammonia, and then another 15 milligrams of organic nitrogen, which is eventually converted to ammonia, and then it's available for the bacteria. So that organic nitrogen is not readily available, but it eventually does become available. So for industry, the incoming TKN and organic nitrogen fraction can be much higher or lower. So when we're looking at nitrification here, predominantly in municipal systems, and certainly in different industries, examples like beef plants have extremely high ammonia. And then there's other industries like paper mills that are very commonly low in nitrogen and need to supplement and generally want to avoid nitrification. So if we're looking at the numbers and how nitrogen is removed, assuming you have 40 milligrams per liter nitrogen and a 200 parts BOD and maybe a example municipal influent, that 15 milligrams per liter of organic nitrogen is eventually broken down to ammonia. So we're getting about 5 milligrams per liter nitrogen for each 100 milligrams per liter BOD removed. So that leaves us with about 30 milligrams per liter left on the plate, so to say. So we're getting about a quarter of it in a normal municipal system just through BOD removal and the bugs taking up nitrogen as a nutrient. And then there's this excess nitrogen, which in order for that to be treated, we need the nitrification process or other forms of nitrogen removal. We're going to focus predominantly here on the nitrification process. The picture on the right here is Nitrosomonas. Nitrosomonas is a genus of nitrifying bacteria there's a broad range of species within that genus, and there's fairly high genetic diversity amongst all of the nitrifiers, basically. So when we look at nitrification, it's a two-step process. The first reaction is oxidizing ammonia to nitrite, and that's done by Nitrosomonas and then other bacteria. So there's other bacteria besides Nitrosomonas that are also capable of doing the first step, and we call those AOBs, ammonia oxidizing bacteria. Generally, based on our experience doing DNA testing in addition to microscopy and consulting, Nitrosomonas tends to be the predominant AOB in most systems. However, Nitrospira, which is usually the most predominant NOB, so nitrite oxidizing bacteria, but Nitrospira is also called a common ox, where it can do both stages. And the science behind why it acts as that is rather poorly understood at this point in time. However, what we have learned is that Nitrospira tends to be the predominant NOB. Sometimes it's also the AOB. If you look at older text, Nitrobacter tends to get a lot of credit for being an NOB, and we do see it in the DNA testing. However, Nitrospira, which you can't identify, it doesn't have any recognizable morphological traits under the microscope, tends to be the main NOB. And in most instances, Nitrobacter is relatively insignificant in terms of nitrification. Important nitrification reactions. So when we convert ammonia to nitrate, we're going to use a substantial amount of oxygen. So 4.57 milligrams oxygen required per each milligram nitrogen oxidized ammonia to eventually nitrate. Then there's also 7.14 milligrams of calcium carbonate alkalinity that's required. So the alkalinity is the buffering capacity that's going to maintain our pH, and it's also the food for the nitrifiers. So if we always want to make sure that alkalinity stays above 50 milligrams per liter as a very bare minimum, otherwise nitrification can be limited from available food from the nitrifiers, the autotrophic bacteria types. So when we have nitrification, there's a very low biomass yield, and there's just not a lot of energy produced in that reaction versus the reactions that you have with heterotrophic bacteria. So there's a low biomass yield, and that's why we need a higher sludge retention time or sludge age to generally sustain a population of nitrifying bacteria. Looking at temperature and impact of nitrification, there are optimal degrees for nitrification. The most important thing to kind of take away from this slide is that as the temperature decreases, the rate of nitrification is going to significantly decrease. And especially we're located in Wisconsin, and the colder climates, you can generally sometimes when you get into the real deep freezes in February and January, that it takes a lot more higher MLSS concentrations and higher SRT values, because the lower temperatures just basically slow down all those biochemical reactions. So once you get below about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, it's very difficult to nitrify. But as it gets warmer, it's certainly easier. So an example, one of a plant in Canada that I'm working with that doesn't, their goal is not to nitrify, and when it gets really cold, right now they're running about a 5-day SRT, and they're not nitrifying, and it's working in terms of preventing the overgrowth of Zuglia bacteria, which is a concern there. So Dissolved oxygen impact on nitrification. So nitrifiers are aerobes. They're strict aerobes. They need free dissolved oxygen in order to work. So in our experience, generally at least 50% of the total time that bugs are in the system, they should be aerated. Otherwise, there can be issues with nitrification if there's just prolonged periods in selector zones or final clarifiers, things like that. There's not a great amount of literature. It's just basically something that Dr. Richards observed and he's passed on, and we've seen kind of a similar thing. In many industrial wastewater treatment processes that can shift selector zones from anaerobic to aerobic, if the ammonia spikes in the effluent because they lose nitrification, a lot of times what we do is we recommend, if you're not nitrifying, take the selector, aerate it as much as possible, get the nitrifiers to come back first, and then once you start to produce nitrate, then we focus on denitrification. pH impact, optimal range is between 7 and 8. The bacteria tend to like a little bit on the higher end, closer to 8. As a general rule, when the pH gets below 7, nitrification as well as floc formation tends to suffer. There's a really big change in the bacteria and the enzyme functionality as you cross over that 7 range. So as a general recommendation, and there's certainly exceptions, there's plants that run successfully at slightly lower pHs, but in general, it's always recommended to try to keep the pH above 7. So when we look at pH, basically what we're doing is we're measuring the amount of hydrogen ions. So a hydrogen ion will lower the pH and a hydroxide ion will raise the pH. So it's a logarithmic scale of hydrogen ions is basically what we're looking at when we're measuring pH. Alkalinity is similar, it's related to pH in a lot of instances, but there's also some instances where they can be separate. So that the easiest way to think of alkalinity is kind of a buffer to, it's a measurement of the ability to resist a decrease of pH. So alkalinity is important because the nitrifying bacteria are especially sensitive to low pH, and we're also consuming a lot of alkalinity through the nitrification process. So it's always important to make sure that we have a lot of alkalinity left over. I like to recommend over 100 milligrams per liter alkalinity. And when we test for alkalinity, we want to make sure that we're testing the mixed liquor, filter that out before it gets to the clarifier, because it is very likely that in the final clarifier, we're going to get some degree of denitrification. And when you denitrify, you're going to recover alkalinity. So what we want to avoid is getting a test that's kind of artificially showing that we have alkalinity where it may not actually be the case in the aeration basin. So it's always best to test the alkalinity from the mixed liquor. So the impact of alkalinity on nitrification, as mentioned, we're going to consume 7.14 milligrams alkalinity every time we are oxidizing ammonia to nitrate. And eventually, if we run out of alkalinity, which is the food for the nitrifiers, we'll stop the process of nitrification. In addition to dropping the pH, which they can have other impacts. So looking at alkalinity, there's a fair amount of important compounds. The hydrogen is going to be impact on the pH. And then we've got, carbonate, bicarbonate, calcium carbonate, other important compounds. So carbonic acid and water, if they mix, or I'm sorry, when carbon dioxide and water mix, they form carbonic acid. So carbonic acid provides carbonate and bicarbonate alkalinity. The hydrogen ion formed would cause the pH to drop. So carbon dioxide has the ability to decrease the pH without necessarily impacting the alkalinity. So that's the basic objective of this slide, is to show that, well, alkalinity and pH, they're not exactly 100% always the case. There are things that can impact the pH without impacting the alkalinity. So calcium carbonate is a major source of alkalinity. It's dissolved in water through geology, limestone, marble. Limestone is made of calcite and dolomite, and limestone becomes marble after heat and metamorphic events occur in the environment. When calcium carbonate reacts with carbonate, this forms bicarbonate, and bicarbonate has it will raise the pH. If it's a high percentage of bicarbonate, it's going to want to be about 8.3 in terms of pH. So you have carbonate and then the bicarbonate. So as the pH shifts, you're going to get a shifting relationship between your carbonate, bicarbonate, and then the carbonic acid, which we're demonstrating on this graph and on this slide. So there is going to be a impact of the pH and the type of alkalinity that's present. So what processes consume alkalinity? Nitrification, we mentioned, a very big impact of alkalinity consumption. If you chlorinate with gaseous chlorination, which is becoming for disinfection, which is becoming less and less frequent, that's going to consume alkalinity. Chemical addition, so like your chemicals that are going to remove phosphorus, your iron, aluminum salts, those will react and consume alkalinity. Then also if you have acid formation, so like when we're looking at anaerobic processes and things like that, when you're in a state of fermentation, you're producing organic acids, which is going to also lower the alkalinity. Now, when organic acids get oxidized, you tend to have a very high alkalinity. So the oxidation of high organic acids will tend to produce higher alkalinity and tend to be the bicarbonate form. So, for example, a lot of treatment plants that have very high BOD concentrations tend to have pH values in the effluent of closer to 8, because there's just more of that organic acids that are oxidized and creating that bicarbonate. So if there's not enough alkalinity present, as we mentioned, that's going to decrease the pH, and it's also going to eventually inhibit nitrification from happening. So we can recover some alkalinity through denitrification, which we'll talk about in the next section of this presentation, or you can supplement alkalinity. And a lot of times the alkalinity that you have is really a function of the location and the geology of where you are. So, you know, a lot of plants in the Midwest have very high hardness and high alkalinity in the groundwater. And they, you know, for example, they use the groundwater for drinking water that makes its way down into the wastewater plant. And a lot of those types of plants very rarely have to add alkalinity, where other instances, you know, you could have low alkalinity starting off, and there are times where you know, supplementing alkalinity may be just the cost of doing business, because there's really no other way around. You have to have that alkalinity if your goal is to nitrify and to maintain the pH in a range where the bacteria want to be. So we have lime, mag hydroxide, magnesium bicarbonate, soda ash, and sodium bicarbonate as different supplements. for if you need to add additional alkalinity. SRT, sludge retention time, is a calculation that determines the average time that a bug would stay in the treatment system. SRT is of particular importance for nitrification because nitrifying bacteria grow very slowly. So we need to have that time in the system. And as we talked about earlier, the low biomass yield and the low growth rates. So we need to have adequate time for those bacteria in the system in order to sustain a population of nitrifying bacteria. Temperature is also going to play a really high role in this, because as the temperatures decrease, all the metabolic rates of the bacteria will also decrease. So generally, if we want to nitrify, anywhere between 5 to 10 to 9, 10 days SRT values are needed. And it's going to be very specific to the plant and things like the BOD to N ratio and the temperature and other factors. So the takeaway from the slide is that you have to have a SRT value that's high enough in order to sustain and continue to grow nitrifying bacteria within the plant. There are some different terms around SRT and different ways of calculating SRT. You'll see the terms mean cell residence time, sludge age. There's other more complex. Basically, it's the calculation of calculating the average time that a theoretical bug would stay in the system. So there's a lot of different ways to calculate it. The biggest thing is that you use the same calculation and you're able to explain that calculation to anybody that might be helping or consulting or that type of thing. So factors for SRT calculation can be measured through determine the mass of solids inventory in the treatment plant. So that's the way I like to think of it, is you have the pounds of bugs in your inventory divided by the pounds of bugs that leave your inventory per day will give you the sludge age or the SRT calculation. Now, there are some factors to take into consideration. For example, if the effluent solids are high, then you're wasting essentially unintentionally, but that can eventually have a big impact on your SRT. And if your effluent TSS is high enough, it might be something that you want to have in that formula. Additionally, there are solids that are in the clarifier, and depending on how high your sludge blankets are, in some instances, it may make sense to account for those solids that are in the clarifier in addition to the solids that are in the aeration basin. And to do that, you can obtain a core sample with the sludge judge, and you have to know the volume of the clarifier, and you can calculate the amount of pounds based on the solids concentration of your core sample of your clarifier. From a practical standpoint, in most cases, I try not to use that just because it's a lot of extra work. However, if you have really big clarifiers and you have really high blankets, then there are times where you want to definitely account for those solids in those calculations. So an example of an SRT calculation would be, number one is we want to determine the pounds of solids in our inventory. So you're going to use the pounds formula. So you take your volume of the basin times your mixed liquor concentration times 8.34 pounds per gallon to give you the pounds of bugs that you have, and then you determine how many leave per day. So basically, you're just dividing what you have by what leaves. So to determine what leaves, you take your wasting rate, your wasting concentration, figure out how many pounds you wasted, and then that'll give you the calculation of what your SRT may be. And as stated before, there are other points that may or may not make sense to add in that calculation, depending on the specific circumstances. So hydraulic retention time also has an impact on nitrification. So personal experience, when we run nitrification studies, bench studies, generally anywhere between 3 to 12 hours of HRT are needed for nitrification, and that's at a bench scale, kind of simulating what your mixed liquor concentration would be in a plug flow kind of a SBR type reactor. So temperature is obviously going to be a major impact. The warmer it is, the faster you're going to begin to nitrify. And then another thing to account for is certain plants have the ability to step feed their waste, where they're feeding influent through different locations of the aeration basin. It's not all going directly to the front end. And especially as the temperature gets colder, there can be a limit to how much influent you can feed further down the basin, because you have to take into consideration the HRT and the amount of time needed for nitrification to happen. So that's going to be a lot slower than like organic acids. When organic acids are oxidized by our heterotrophic bacteria in wastewater, generally within that first 15 to 30 minutes of the aeration basin, we're going to get a lot of oxidation. We're going to get a lot of storage, and the majority of the BOD that's readily available tends to be either oxidized or stored really quickly in the reactor, where nitrification is going to take much longer. So the first stage of nitrification is the conversion of free ammonia to nitrite, and then the second is the conversion of nitrite to nitrate. So there's 2 steps, and there's very often 2 different genera of bacteria that are responsible for that reaction. And when we look at the genetic diversity of nitrifying bacteria, we can see that there's a fair amount of different phylum that are capable, that produce nitrifiers. And then also, when you look at Nitrosomonas, that right now, currently, the latest year for 2021 is we're up to 85 separate species of the Nitrosomonas genus. So there's very high genetic diversity within nitrifying bacteria, and there's other, so for example, like Brocadia can function as both an AOB and an NOB. We mentioned Nitrospira can be a variable AOB. So, and there's also a few unknown tax IDs and other genus that haven't even been named yet that are we see that are in the same family, and more than likely there's going to be, if we look at this graph 5 years from now, we're going to see a lot of officially other recognized genus that are capable of nitrification. So nitrification issues can happen when the conditions in the plant are outside our target values. So the temperature gets too cold, or the SRT value is not right, the alkalinity, the pH, those are all going to play a significant role. Ammonia concentrations exceed time and numbers, then you're going to have excess ammonia. Inhibition of nitrifying bacteria is fairly common, where basically something comes down and it stops the enzymes from working, and it doesn't always kill them. Sometimes you get toxicity and death, and other times you get kind of a scenario where you have the nitrifying bacteria present, but they're just not nitrifying because there's an external condition causing the enzymes to not work properly. Treatment plants that do not typically nitrify and suddenly the BOD to N to P ratio drifts outside of what normally is. So for example, if you have a very low amount of ammonia naturally, and then all of a sudden your ammonia stays the same and your BOD decreases, you can see this is sometimes occurs in different industrial facilities, where then all of a sudden you just don't have that carbon and that BOD, and then you're left with a lot of ammonia left on the plate. And in some instances, we supplementing a carbon source that doesn't have ammonia to get that BOD to N ratio back, where you're getting more nitrogen removal through assimilation of new biomass, is the really good strategy to knock it down. Other times, if there's a lot of variability, sometimes you're better off maintaining a certain population of nitrifying bacteria and just kind of accepting that it's good to have those nitrifying bacteria available for times where that BOD to N ratio does change. Now, eventually, if you don't have ammonia, you will lose your nitrifying bacteria. So from a time and number standpoint, one troubleshooting method, one thing I like to recommend is, if the ammonia is high in the effluent, if you collect the mixed liquor sample and you put it in a beaker and you put an air stone in there and you aerate it overnight, does that ammonia come down the next day in the morning? And if it does deplete, then this is telling you that you do have nitrifying bacteria, you do have conditions where nitrification can happen. However, you just don't have the time or the numbers. So in that case, you're going to need to increase the MLSS or the sludge retention time in order to increase your abundance of nitrifying bacteria. Nitrifying bacteria inhibition: if effluent ammonia concentrations are fluctuating and you have a fairly steady BOD to N ratio in your influent, then this is a really big red flag that there might be intermittent inhibition occurring. So, you always want to start with the basics, make sure that the dissolved oxygen, the sludge age, the pH, the alkalinity, all of that's in a good range. And if it's still not nitrifying, then it's very likely that there's an inhibition that may be occurring. And some of these inhibitions include, or some of the things that you can do would be to reduce sulfide formation. Sulfide can be very toxic to nitrifying bacteria. So especially as the pH decreases closer to 7, that sulfide tends to have a really big impact on nitrification. And then also reducing areas of organic acids. So if certain organic acids, generally the odd carbon propionic acid, are present at high enough abundance, they tend to be really difficult for the nitrifying bacteria, especially the NOBs, and that's where you tend to run into a lot of problems. So septicity, and then also, before nitrification can happen, you have to have most of your BOD gone, and the bacteria kind of entering that starvation state, or that endogenous state, where they're now the once the BOD removal happens, then the nitrification happens after. In severe instances, stressful events have the potential to kill nitrifying bacteria. So this is showing an example of, this is a viability stain. We use fluorescent microscopy in all microscopic evaluations. So we also get an idea of anything that's green turns or is alive, and anything that fluoresces red would indicate dead or non-viable. So here you can see the filaments are there, but they're dead. And looking at that, so sometimes if there's a major event, you can kill the nitrifying bacteria. Now, if the proper conditions are in place, they'll come back, but they do grow slowly. So natural recovery can be slow. There are times where case dependent, it does make sense to inoculate the treatment plant with nitrifying bacteria. Now, however, it's also really important, because if there's something that stressed out your original nitrifiers and you reseed with more nitrifiers, if you still have that stress there, they're going to have the same fate as the previous nitrifiers. So you can bioaugment with nitrifying bacteria, and it is successful in, if the conditions are right. I have seen where it increases the recovery time, sometimes by a day or two. I often recommend DNA testing to get an idea of, are they there or are they wiped out? And so basically on the microscope, I can see Nitrosomonas, Nitrobacter, but some of the other nitrifiers you can't see. So generally, based on our experience in most municipal treatment plants, if you have about 1% of your DNA reads as nitrifiers, you tend to get good ammonia removal or good nitrification. And that's going to vary a lot when you get into industrial processes. So in addition to septicity, we talked about, organic acids and sulfide. There's a lot of other things that can inhibit nitrification. So quaternary ammonia compounds, anything greater than 10 milligrams per liter bound in the solids is recognized to inhibit nitrification, and a whole nother other list of surfactants and cyanide, amines, hydrocarbons, peracetic acid. There's a lot of other things that can inhibit nitrification, which can make troubleshooting complicated. So generally, you want to start with what you can change easily, like kind of low hanging. Then you want to look at septicity, and then if that's not the case, then you're looking at, is there any sanitation chemicals or things like that that are being used in the process that could be damaging the nitrifying bacteria. Additional considerations is, we talked about kind of a changing of the BOD to N ratio. So, and if you have a lot left over and you don't have nitrifiers, then you have to make a decision. Are you going to nitrify, or do you have to have more carbon and less nitrogen in the influent in order to assimilate more removal through, through new biomass? What can be a very common problem is if you overdose the supplements for nitrogen, you may have nitrification develop, and that can lead to other problems, such as in some industries it can exceed the oxygen demand. You can lose your alkalinity, and you also risk denitrification in the final clarifier. So especially if the plant's really highly loaded and the sludge is fairly not super stable with a fairly high oxygen uptake rate as it's entering the clarifier. If you have that nitrate there, you have a recipe where you could get some floating sludge in your clarifier. So always case specific in terms of that, but sometimes in certain plants you want to avoid nitrification if you can, especially from the cost perspective and the aeration demand that is posed for nitrification. Nitrite lock would be considered partial nitrification. So if you have a condition of nitrite lock, the first set of bacteria, the AOB, do their job. They convert the ammonia to the nitrite. However, the second, the NOBs, are inhibited. So the bacteria, the NOBs that convert nitrite to nitrate, tend to be more sensitive to a lot of stresses than the AOBs. Nitrite's also highly toxic to aquatic life, and if you have disinfection through chlorination, every part per million of nitrite is going to require 5 parts chlorine before you're able to get that residual. So just a very small amount of nitrite can really pose challenges with disinfection and meeting meeting limits like fecal limits, things along those lines. So so basically, generally you don't want to see next to anything for nitrite. And if you do have measurable nitrite, it's usually a sign that there's something wrong with your NOB bacteria. And when you look at the troubleshooting strategies for nitrite lock, it's going to really mirror the same as when we're looking at why is it not nitrifying. Now, there are some instances, there are some certain bacteria that are capable of partial denitrification. So they can take nitrate and reduce it to nitrite. So microthrips filaments are very often suspected in these instances. So if you have septicity in the clarifier, you have a lot of microthrips, you can get an incomplete partial denitrification where you didn't have nitrite to begin with, but now you have the septicity, and the microthrips don't do the full set of denitrification, they only do partial. So nitrite can be a result of not nitrifying fully, or in some rare instances, it can be you nitrified and then you have partial denitrification. Whole effluent toxicity, or your wet testing, ammonia toxicity is very common for wet test failures. At higher pH values, more NH3 is present, which is more toxic. And as the pH values decrease, you get more NH4, which tends to be easier on the Daphnia and the other organisms in that test. Generally, at nitrite concentrations of greater than 0.75 milligrams per liter, you'll begin to notice an impact of aquatic life. And at greater than 5 milligrams per liter nitrite, toxicity is recognized. So nitrite is nasty stuff. It doesn't take a lot of it to to cause issues like disinfection, the chlorine demand associated with it. And also, if you have ammonia, very often that can also be one of the low-hanging things that you look for if you have a wet test failure. So now that we've covered the topic of nitrification, we're going to talk about denitrification. So basically, in this scenario, in this schematic described here, we have in our aerobic zone, we have, that's where we're going to convert, we're taking up all our BOD, and then we're going to nitrify. And then we have a recycle stream of your mixed liquor that can go back to the anoxic zone. And in the anoxic zone, our goal is to denitrify. This schematic also has your RAS going to the mixing with the influent into an anaerobic zone. So this particular process would be configured for enhanced biological phosphorus removal. So that your goal would be to obtain your VFA uptake and orthophosphate release in the anaerobic zone. And then in the anoxic zone, your goal would be to denitrify using that RAS from that recycle stream and the nitrate available to turn that nitrate to nitrogen gas, which eventually escapes to the atmosphere. So denitrification is the process in which heterotrophic bacteria reduce nitrate to nitrite and then nitrite to nitrogen gas. For denitrification to occur, the following are needed: anoxic conditions, a carbon source, and also the presence of nitrate. So some of the important reactions that we see in denitrification is we are going to recover some dissolved oxygen. So by introducing denitrification, 2.86 milligrams oxygen is released per every milligram of nitrogen removed. So as you're removing that NO3 and that gas is going to the atmosphere, you're leaving behind some oxygen. So most commonly, about 30 to 40% of your oxygen that you lose through the process of nitrification can be recovered with denitrification. Now, in order to get the ORP values low enough where we're using we have anoxic reactions, we have to have enough carbon. So ultimately the BOD or the COD is going to be a driver, and that can be, sometimes it's internally stored by the bacteria as like PHB, or it can be external carbon, but you need to have something that's kind of driving that oxygen uptake rate of the bacteria in order for them to deplete all the necessary free dissolved oxygen and begin to work on the nitrate. So in general, about 8.6 milligrams COD is needed per every milligram of nitrate that you want to remove and turn into gas. But that can vary a lot depending on individual circumstances. We're also going to recover about half of our alkalinity if we can denitrify, efficiently. So one of the things for plants that have issues with alkalinity is if they can denitrify and they can recover that's going to help them in terms of maintaining alkalinity, pH, and sometimes lowering the cost of supplementation. And when you look at denitrification, there's a lot of energy produced, even though it's an anoxic and not an aerobic reaction. There's a very similar cell yield. So denitrification happens quickly as long as you have the driving force, which is that carbon source. So when you look at denitrification and ORP values, generally I like to say negative DO, and if you start to get lower than like minus 100 for the ORP, then it's very common that the nitrate is all depleted at that point in time. So when effluent nitrate concentrations are higher than desired, it's usually because there's a lack of available carbon or food to drive denitrifications. In many instances, carbon supplementation has been used to assist with reducing effluent nitrate concentrations. So basically, if you looking at the schematic here, if if most of the food from the influent is depleted in the anaerobic, where the PAOs are storing and they're getting a competitive advantage, if there's not enough food to drive that ORP and that anoxic zone, then you can have a condition where there's just not enough food to drive that ORP low enough in order to remove the amount of nitrate that you would want. And there's a lot of different schematics and different ideas here, but it's a similar thing. And in order to get rid of nitrate, you need carbon, you need BOD to drive those reactions. So this schematic here shows a situation where you have a post-anoxic tank. So here, you're going to aerobic, anoxic, and then basically there's still nitrate there, and they need to add methanol as a carbon source, which is, most plants are getting away from methanol. There's some safety risks. There's some commercial carbon supplements. Sometimes industrial wastewater can be used, but here you basically there's not enough BOD after it's already been through the aeration basin to really optimize denitrification. And as a general rule, it's always good. You see on this schematic here, you have a post-aerobic zone. So you don't want to go into the final clarifier, the secondary clarifier, without free dissolved oxygen, because if you have nitrate present and without free dissolved oxygen, now you're putting yourself at risk to have floating sludge in the clarifier. You can denitrify. One of the nice things about SBRs is you can set up different cycles and different times for different reactions. So very commonly in a SBR process, after you nitrify, you can have an anoxic reaction where the oxygen is turned off, the aerator is turned off, and just mixing occurs. And that's allowing us to remove the nitrate, turn it into nitrogen gas, as well as recover some of the alkalinity and the DO, and especially critical for plants that may have total nitrogen limits or nitrate limits, things along those lines. So there are some other configurations. There's plants that achieve nitrification and denitrification simultaneously. Some plants cycle the aeration, and by turning the air on and off, they're able to get some degree of denitrification. Some plants kind of taper the DO down and end up trying to get some of that simultaneous nitrification and denite towards the latter stages of the basin. The biggest thing with that is you want to always make sure, ideally, that you're entering that clarifier in an aerobic stage. So for the plants that do taper down the DO, in a general recommendation, it's good to get that DO up pretty high before it goes into the clarifier. There's also some methods where you can denitrify through denitrification filters. This shows an example of your the raw water would be your effluent. It's going through this filter where you're dosing an external carbon supplement in order to remove the nitrate, and then the reject water would go back to the treatment plant. So denitrification, well, it's desired and it's needed to remove nitrate. There's also some potential problems that can happen. So you want denitrification in the targeted zone of the treatment plant. So you don't want it in the final clarifier. And there's two things that can happen there. You can have a situation where the sludge floats to the top of the clarifier, and then you can also have nitrogen gas entrapment. So that's where the flocks are strong enough that it doesn't always necessarily float. However, you tend to get elevated blankets, and sometimes that can interfere with your SVI values if you have nitrogen gas that's been formed either in the aeration basin or as it's settling. So other issues could be denitrification foaming. So if the rate of nitrogen gas exceeds the mixing capacity, it tends to take those flocks up with it, and that can create foam. And those foams can be in the anoxic zones, sometimes clarifier, center wells, clarifier, the aeration basin itself. So just because you have a DO residual or measurement in your aeration basin doesn't always mean that the interior of your flocks are anoxic. So you can have a condition where, if you have a set point of 2 milligrams per liter per DO, as that DO penetrates the flocks, the bacteria, as you get to the inside of the flock, all the DO is gone. And if you've nitrified, now you have now you have nitrate for an oxygen source for the bacteria, and then that's going to create denitrification. So there are there's a good test I like to recommend where Dr. Richard invented it called the paddle test. And if you have nitrogen gas that's entrapped in the flocks, if you do two settleometers side by side, one with your normal mixing and one that you mix for 2 to 3 minutes really vigorously to drive out any gas. If you see that the settleometer that has significantly more mixing, if that test settles much better, that's telling you it's not a filament issue, it's not a bulking issue, it's just a issue of nitrogen gas entrapment, and it's telling you that it's denitrifying in an area that's not desired. So usually in those instances, you want to try to slow down the oxygen uptake rate, which is very often, not always, but very often accomplished through increasing the SRT values. Abnormal nitrogen removal. So with wastewater, there's always exceptions to everything, and there's always other things. And as we begin to learn more about DNA and roles of different bacteria, there's a lot of complexities that I feel is worth covering. So there are a potential for anoxic denitrification. So there are certain types of bacteria that can actually denitrify in the presence of oxygen. And then so the aerobic denitrification, well, it's not super common. It is something that can happen. It's a process reducing nitrate into a gaseous nitrogen form, even if it has oxygen gas. So those bugs are just, they're going to go after that nitrate no matter what, regardless. So in most bacteria, if you have free dissolved oxygen, it's going to be inhibitory, but there are some exceptions. So I just thought that was worth noting. Others, we've discovered, or other people have discovered, there's some archaeal nitrification and some, so you have bacteria and archaea in that can both be present, and generally archaea are fairly low populations in activated sludge processes. However, there are some that are recognized to be nitrifiers. So it's possible to have nitrification and not even necessarily see it on the DNA scan, because if you for a DNA test, you can either run bacteria or you can run archaea. So for anaerobic conditions, the methanogens are archaea, and basically you need to have an idea of both from an anaerobic system, because you have the methanogens and you have the acid forming bacteria, which are bacteria. So when we look at activated sludge and things like that, we focus strictly on the bacteria, but it is important to know there's some other organisms that could potentially nitrify. All of these conversions are dependent on the assortment of oxidation reduction reactions performed by a diverse microorganisms such as bacteria and fungi can also contribute to that. So there's some outliers basically. And then I also felt that it was necessary to talk a little about Animox. So Animox is fairly recent. It's takes ammonia to nitrite, but it skips that second stage of nitrite to nitrate, and it goes from nitrite directly into dinitrogen gas. So Animox is becoming more common in like side stream processes, in which you have like your waste activated sludge is being treated, and you want to recover, or you want to decrease that ammonia, but you don't want to have the full alkalinity consumption, DO consumption. So basically you have to prevent that second step of nitrification occurring in those systems. So compared to conventional nitrification, Animox eliminates the necessity of an organic carbon source, which is also beneficial, and it reduces the energy demand for aeration, has a smaller production of excess sludge and also lower CO2 emissions. So the Animox, it's finicky. They tend to be slow growing. There are a number of plants that have successfully incorporated Animox. There are a few, I believe, in the world right now that are doing it at a full scale, the the full treatment. However, at this point in time, 2022, it tends to be, we're starting to see more of that in side streams and sludge, sludge, return streams, things like that. The biggest concern is that we also need to maintain really good quality of bacteria and settling. So if so we don't want to have Animox at the sacrifice of settling and other things like that. So there's definitely a lot. My prediction would be, if we have a follow-up in 5 years, there's going to be a lot of additional information that could be added to this. However, I feel that this hopefully provides a really nice guideline and something that would be useful from an operational standpoint and troubleshooting standpoint. So appreciate it, and have a good one. Thank you.